The most dangerous moment in a man's life is not when he loses everything, but when he realizes he never understood what truly mattered. And Richard Hayes was seconds away from that moment without even knowing it, as the soft glow of crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, and the quiet hum of a $200 per plate restaurant wrapped around him like a world built for men who never had to apologize. He sat there in a tailored navy suit, fingers tapping impatiently against the table, his $30,000 watch catching the light with every movement, while across from him stood a waitress named Emily Carter, her black uniform simple, her posture calm, her presence almost invisible to everyone except him. And tonight that was a problem, because the bill in his hand didn't match what he expected, and Richard Hayes did not tolerate mistakes, not in boardrooms, not in business, and certainly not in places where he paid for perfection. "Is this some kind of joke?" he said without looking up, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air as nearby conversations softened, people subtly turning. Because when a billionaire speaks, people listen. But Emily didn't flinch. She simply stepped closer, her voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir. Let me take another look." And there it was, that tone, calm, composed, almost unbothered. Something about it irritated him more than the mistake itself, because he was used to nervous apologies, to rushed corrections, to people bending slightly under his presence. But not her, never her. And if you've ever seen someone stay that calm under pressure, you know it makes you pause, maybe even wonder what they know that you don't. And if a moment like that has ever made you stop and think, you might understand why some stories deserve a closer look, why some quiet people aren't what they seem. But Richard didn't think, he reacted. "People like you shouldn't make mistakes like this," he said, finally looking up, his eyes cold, dismissive. The kind of look that had closed million-dollar deals and ended careers in a single meeting. And still, Emily didn't respond the way he expected. No apologies spilling over, no panic, just a small nod as she reached for the bill, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. "I'll fix it right away," she said softly. But Richard was already done with patience, already reaching the edge of his tolerance. "No," he said, louder now, enough that the manager turned from across the room. "Get your manager. I'm not paying for incompetence." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted, forks paused mid-air, glasses held just a second too long. The invisible tension of wealth and power pressing down on a moment that should have been small but wasn't, because something about this felt different, though Richard couldn't yet explain why. And as Emily bent slightly to gather the bill, the movement was simple, routine, but it revealed something unexpected. A thin silver necklace slipping from beneath her collar, catching the chandelier light for just a second, long enough for Richard's eyes to lock onto it, long enough for something buried deep in his memory to stir, something he hadn't thought about in years. And suddenly the noise of the restaurant faded, the irritation, the control, the certainty. All of it paused on a single detail he couldn't ignore. As his voice, when it came again, was quieter, almost unfamiliar. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and for the first time that night, it wasn't a command, it was a question. Emily did not answer immediately, and for a brief moment the world seemed to hold its breath as she gently straightened up, the silver necklace resting quietly against her collarbone like it had always belonged there, her fingers brushing at once as if out of habit rather than awareness. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, almost distant. "My mother gave it to me," she said, not defensive, not emotional. Just stating a fact, the way someone mentions the weather, but something in the way she said mother carried weight, the kind of weight that does not come from the word itself, but from everything it holds behind it. And Richard felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in his chest, like a door somewhere inside him had been nudged open without permission. "Where did she get it?" he asked again, more quietly now, his tone stripped of the authority it carried just seconds ago. And that was when Emily looked at him fully for the first time. Not as a customer, not as a man with power, but as someone she was trying to read, her eyes steady, searching, as if measuring whether the question deserved an answer. "She never said," Emily replied after a pause, her gaze lingering just long enough to make something uncomfortable settle between them. "Only that it belonged to someone who left." And the words landed softly, but they did not feel soft. They settled into the space between them like something unfinished, something waiting. And Richard felt his fingers tighten slightly against the edge of the table as a memory flickered in the back of his mind. Not clear enough to grasp, not strong enough to ignore, just a fragment. A woman laughing under warm light. A promise made too easily. A goodbye he never stayed long enough to feel. And suddenly the restaurant around him felt different. The polished floors, the quiet conversations, the distant clink of glasses, all of it fading into something distant and irrelevant as his focus narrowed entirely onto the girl standing in front of him. Because she was no longer just a waitress. Not anymore. There was something else there, something that did not fit neatly into the life he had built, and that realization made him uncomfortable in a way he could not control. "What is your name?" he asked, the question coming out before he had time to consider why it mattered. And Emily did not hesitate this time. "Emily Carter," she said. Simple, direct. But the moment the name left her lips, something shifted again, not outside, but inside him, subtle, almost imperceptible, like hearing a melody you have not thought about in years but still recognize instantly. And Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her now with a different kind of attention, no longer dismissive, no longer irritated, but focused, calculating, trying to make sense of something that did not follow logic, because in his world everything had a place, everything had a reason, and yet nothing about this moment made sense. Not the necklace, not the way she spoke, not the strange familiarity that was beginning to form where certainty used to live. And across from him, Emily remained still, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged. But there was something in her expression now, something quieter, more guarded, as if she had noticed the shift in him and was waiting to see what he would do with it. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Hayes did not have an immediate answer. Richard Hayes had built his entire life on certainty, numbers that aligned, decisions that made sense, outcomes he could predict 3 steps ahead. And yet as he sat there watching Emily Carter stand quietly in front of him, none of it applied, because there was something about her presence that refused to fit into the clean structure of his world, something unmeasurable, something that did not follow logic, and that unsettled him more than any financial risk ever could, his mind searching for answers while his instincts told him to dismiss the feeling, to return to control, to re-establish the distance that had always protected him. But the problem was he could not look away, not now, not after the necklace, not after the way she had spoken about her mother, as if the past was not a story but a weight she still carried. And across from him Emily remained composed, but inside she was not untouched by the moment, because she had seen men like him before, men who spoke in tones that assumed obedience, men who believed money defined value, and she had learned long ago not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. But this was different, not because of his status, but because of the way his question had changed, the way his voice had shifted from command to something closer to uncertainty. And that was rare enough that she noticed it immediately, even if she did not fully understand it. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, returning to the role she knew, the structure that kept things simple. But Richard did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed on her, studying details he would have ignored just minutes ago, the way she stood straight but not rigid, the way her hands remained steady despite the tension around them, the quiet confidence in someone who had learned to endure without needing recognition. And for a brief moment something unexpected surfaced in him, not pity, not curiosity alone, but something closer to recognition, as if he had seen that strength before in a different time, in a different life. And that thought lingered longer than it should have, pulling at something he had spent years burying. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying an undercurrent he could not explain. And Emily blinked slightly, surprised by the shift, but answering anyway. "Almost 3 years, she said, her voice even. "It pays the bills," she added, not as a complaint, just a fact. And Richard nodded slowly, processing more than her words, because 3 years meant consistency, meant routine, meant she was not passing through but staying, building something quiet and steady in a world that rarely noticed people like her. And that contrast struck him, because his world moved fast. Decisions made in hours, fortunes built and lost in days, while hers seemed to move in quiet persistence, measured not in profit, but in survival. And the more he observed, the more that difference became impossible to ignore. And before this? He asked, leaning slightly forward now, his attention no longer casual. And for the first time, Emily hesitated, not long, just enough to show that the question had touched something she usually kept hidden, her fingers brushing lightly against the necklace again. A small, almost unconscious movement. Just different jobs, she said, carefully choosing the words that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. And Richard noticed. He noticed the hesitation, the deflection, the way her answer closed a door rather than opened one. And instead of pushing harder, something inside him told him to pause, because whatever truth stood between them was not something that could be forced. It was something that would reveal itself, slowly, whether he was ready for it or not. And for the first time in years, Richard Hayes found himself waiting rather than controlling, watching rather than deciding, and the unfamiliar feeling settled over him like a quiet warning he could not yet understand. The silence between them stretched just long enough to become noticeable, not awkward, but charged, like something unseen had entered the space and neither of them knew how to address it. And before Richard could decide what to say next, the manager arrived, his steps quick, his expression already apologetic. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry for the inconvenience," he began, his tone carefully respectful, the kind reserved for men whose names carried weight beyond the room. "We will correct the bill immediately." But Richard did not look at him, his attention still fixed on Emily, as if the conversation happening beside him was secondary, almost irrelevant. "It is fine," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, surprising even himself, and the manager blinked slightly, caught off guard by the sudden shift, because this was not how these situations usually ended, not with calm, not with dismissal. But before he could question it, Richard added, "I will keep her." The words simple, but they landed differently, and Emily felt it, the subtle shift from judgment to something else, something she could not yet define. And for the first time since the interaction began, there was a flicker of tension in her chest, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, because men like him did not change direction without a reason, and reasons always came with consequences. "Very well, sir," the manager said, stepping back, though his eyes lingered on Emily for a second longer, a silent warning to remain careful, and then he was gone, leaving the two of them alone again in a room full of people who had already begun pretending not to watch. And Richard leaned back slightly, exhaling a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his fingers brushing the edge of the table once more, slower this time, less impatient, more deliberate. "Sit down," he said suddenly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, the request unexpected, out of place in the rhythm of a restaurant where roles were clearly defined. And Emily did not move, her expression unchanged but her mind alert, calculating, because this was no longer about a bill, no longer about a mistake. Something else was unfolding, something that did not belong to her usual routine. "I am working," she replied calmly, her tone respectful but firm, not refusing, but not agreeing either. And Richard studied her for a moment, noting the boundary she had just drawn without raising her voice, without breaking her composure. And instead of pushing, he nodded once, almost approvingly. "Then stand," he said, softer now, less like an order and more like a compromise. And she did, remaining where she was, her presence steady, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because whatever was building between them was not something that could be rushed. It was something that required space, silence, attention. And Richard realized that for the first time in years, he was not interested in ending the conversation quickly, not interested in efficiency or control. He was interested in understanding, even if he did not yet know why. "Did your mother ever tell you his name?" he asked finally, the question direct but carrying something heavier beneath it, something personal. And Emily's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, as if the answer required her to look somewhere deeper than the room they stood in, her fingers brushing the necklace again, that same small movement that seemed to anchor her. "No," she said after a pause, her voice quieter now, not weaker, but more distant. She said it did not matter. And that was when something inside Richard tightened, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to make him aware of it. Because for a man who had spent his life believing that everything mattered, every detail, every decision, every name. Hearing that something as significant as a person could be dismissed as irrelevant did not sit comfortably. It did not align with the world he understood. And yet the more he looked at Emily, the more he realized that her world had never followed his rules, and that realization lingered between them, quiet, unresolved, waiting for something neither of them had said yet. Richard did not respond right away, and the quiet between them deepened. No longer just tension, but something heavier, something that pressed against his thoughts in a way he could not ignore, because the idea that a man could simply not matter, that he could walk away and become nothing more than a forgotten detail in someone else's life, did not align with anything he believed about himself, about legacy, about impact. And yet here it was, standing in front of him in the form of a woman who carried that absence like it had shaped her, and for the first time a question surfaced that he could not push aside, not because it was convenient, but because it felt necessary. "How old were you when she told you that?" he asked, his voice lower now, more careful, as if the answer required a different kind of attention, and Emily's expression shifted just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for him, because he was watching her now in a way he had not watched anyone in years. "She did not tell me," Emily said quietly. "I figured it out." And that answer landed differently, sharper in its honesty, and Richard felt something tighten. Again, that same subtle pull in his chest that had no place in the life he had built. "And you never tried to find him?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it, and Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Find who?" she replied, tilting her head slightly, her eyes steady on his. "A man who chose not to stay." And there it was, not anger, not bitterness, just a simple truth stated without decoration. And for a moment Richard had no response, because her words did not accuse him, did not point fingers, but they carried something heavier than blame. They carried indifference, and that unsettled him more than anything else could have, because anger he understood, conflict he could manage, but indifference meant there was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to prove, and that realization lingered just long enough to shift something inside him. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed everything. Emily reached for the check presenter on the table, opening it to replace the corrected bill, and as she did, a small folded piece of paper slipped from inside, falling gently onto the table between them, neither of them expecting it, neither of them prepared for what it might be, and Emily paused, her hand hovering for just a second before she picked it up, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked at it. "This is not mine," she said, more to herself than to him. But Richard's attention had already shifted, something about the moment pulling him in. "What is it?" he asked, and Emily hesitated, then unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the contents, and for the first time since he had met her, her composure cracked, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else in the room. But he saw it, the way her breath caught just slightly, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. And when she looked up at him again, something had changed, something undeniable. "It is a name," she said slowly, her voice no longer distant, no longer neutral, but carrying something deeper, something that had just shifted inside her as well. And she held the paper out toward him, her hand steady despite the weight of what she had just read. "Richard Hayes," she said, and for the first time that night, the world did not just pause, it stopped. For a man who had controlled every outcome of his life, Richard Hayes had never felt this kind of stillness before. Not the calm of confidence, but the kind that comes when everything you believe about yourself is quietly unraveling. And he stared at the piece of paper in Emily's hand as if it did not belong to him, as if the name written there could somehow be a coincidence. But it was not just the name. It was the way she was looking at him now, not as a customer, not even as a stranger, but as someone standing on the edge of an answer neither of them had asked for. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice no longer steady, and Emily shook her head slightly, still processing. "It was inside the check holder," she said, her words slower now, careful, as if each one carried weight. "I have never seen it before," and the truth in her voice made it harder to deny what was happening, because there was no performance in her reaction, no manipulation, just confusion layered over something deeper, something that was beginning to form as realization. And Richard leaned forward, his hand reaching out, but stopping just short of taking the paper. because some part of him already knew that once he touched it, once he accepted it, there would be no stepping back, no returning to the version of himself who walked into this restaurant thinking this was just another evening. "Say it again," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before repeating, "Richard Hayes," and hearing his own name spoken like that, not with recognition, not with admiration, but with uncertainty, was something he had never experienced before, and it cut deeper than any criticism ever had, because it forced him to see himself not as the world saw him, but as someone who might have been missing from a story that should have included him. And the weight of that realization pressed down slowly, not all at once, but enough to make it impossible to ignore. And Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the paper as she studied his reaction, watching for something. Maybe denial, maybe anger, maybe explanation, but what she saw instead was something far more unsettling: hesitation, the kind that comes from recognition. And her voice, when she spoke again, was quieter, but sharper. "Do you know why your name would be here?" And the question hung between them, simple but impossible, because any answer would change everything. And for a moment Richard did not speak, not because he could not, but because he was choosing whether to, weighing the consequences of truth against the comfort of silence. And if you have ever been in a moment where the next sentence could change your entire life, you know that pause, that hesitation, that invisible line between who you were and who you are about to become. And as the restaurant continued around them, unaware, unchanged, Richard Hayes realized that no amount of money, no level of control, could prepare him for what came next. Emily did not lower her hand, and the paper remained between them like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. And the longer Richard stayed silent, the more the weight of that silence began to shift into something else, something that did not need words to be understood, because answers are not always spoken. Sometimes they are revealed in what a person cannot say. And Emily noticed it, the hesitation, the way his eyes did not move away from the name, the way his posture, once sharp and controlled, had softened just enough to show something underneath, something uncertain. And that was when a second detail surfaced, small, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once seen: the necklace around her neck, the same one he had asked about moments ago. It was not just familiar, it was exact, the delicate engraving, the tiny imperfection along the edge, details most people would never notice, but he did, because he had chosen it himself, years ago, in a moment he had long buried under decisions that seemed more important at the time. And suddenly the fragments in his mind began to connect, not fully, not clearly, but enough to form something undeniable, a memory of a woman standing by a window, sunlight catching that same silver pendant, her laughter soft, her voice telling him something he had not stayed long enough to hear. And Richard inhaled slowly, the air feeling heavier than it should, because this was no longer a coincidence, it was a pattern, and patterns did not lie. "Your mother," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile truth was forming between them. "What was her name?" And Emily's gaze did not waver, but there was something different in it now, something sharper, more focused, because she had begun to see it too, not clearly, not completely, but enough to know that this moment was no longer ordinary. "Why does it matter now?" she asked, not defensively, but with a calm that carried its own weight. And it was a fair question, one that forced Richard to confront something he had avoided for years. Because why now? Why here? Why after all this time? And he did not have an answer that would make sense, not yet. And that hesitation spoke louder than anything he could say. And Emily noticed, because she had spent her life reading what people did not say, learning to understand the space between words. And what she saw in him now was not arrogance, not control, but something closer to recognition. And that unsettled her in a way she could not fully explain, because recognition meant connection, and connection meant questions she had never allowed herself to ask. And for a brief moment her fingers tightened around the necklace, not consciously, but instinctively, as if grounding herself in something she had always known, something that had always been hers, and yet now felt different, heavier, as if it carried more than just memory. And if you were watching this unfold, you might begin to wonder the same thing both of them were beginning to feel. that the story they thought they understood was only a surface, that beneath it there was something deeper, something waiting, and Richard finally spoke again, not with certainty, but with a quiet urgency that betrayed how much this mattered now. "Because I think I knew her," he said, and the words were simple, but they changed everything, because they were no longer a question. They were the first step toward a truth neither of them could walk away from. Emily held his gaze for a long second, searching, not for confidence but for truth, and whatever she saw there made her choice for her, because slowly, almost carefully, she spoke a name he had not heard in over 2 decades. Her name was Laura Bennett. In the moment those words left her lips, something inside Richard broke open, not loudly, not visibly to anyone else in the room, but completely, because it was not just a memory anymore. It was real. It was here, standing in front of him in a way he could not escape, and his hand finally moved, taking the paper from her fingers, not to confirm the name, but because he needed something to hold on to as the past came rushing back with a clarity he had not expected. Laura standing in a small apartment filled with sunlight, that same necklace in her hand as she laughed, and said it was too much, him insisting, promising things he had no intention of keeping, telling himself he would come back when things settled, when his career took off, when life made more sense, and then never coming back at all, because success came faster than expected, and with it came 1,000 distractions that made forgetting easy, until now, and his voice, when it came, was no longer controlled, no longer measured. She was pregnant, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, the realization forming as he spoke it, and Emily's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, her eyes narrowing just slightly, her breath catching in a way she could not hide this time, because this was no longer a distant story. It was something personal, something dangerously close. "You knew?" she asked, and there was something new in her voice now, not anger, not yet, but something sharper, something that had been waiting for a reason to surface, and Richard shook his head slowly, the movement small but heavy. "I suspected," he admitted, the words difficult in a way nothing else had been for him. "She tried to tell me. I just did not stay long enough to listen." And the honesty of it hung between them, raw and incomplete, because it was not an excuse, not even an explanation. It was simply the truth, and Emily looked at him, really looked this time, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the absence she had grown up with, the unanswered questions, the quiet spaces where something should have been but never was. And her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, her composure still there, but thinner now, stretched by something deeper than she was used to showing. "She never said your name," Emily said slowly, each word deliberate. "Not once." And that landed harder than anything else, because it meant he had not just been absent, he had been erased, not out of hatred, not out of anger, but out of choice. And for the first time in his life, Richard Hayes understood what it meant to not matter in someone's story, and the weight of that realization settled fully, undeniable. And yet, even in that moment, something else surfaced, something that shifted the ground beneath them both. Because if she never knew his name, if her mother had never told her, then how had it ended up on that paper? How had it found its way back into this moment? And Richard looked at the folded note in his hand, then back at Emily, the question forming silently between them before either of them spoke it out loud. Because this was no longer just about the past. It was about something else, something neither of them had seen coming, something that suggested this meeting was not an accident at all. Richard looked at the paper again, then slowly turned it over as if expecting more answers to be hidden on the other side. But there was nothing, just that one name written in a careful hand, a hand that did not belong to him. And that was when Emily spoke, her voice steady but no longer distant. "My mother kept a small box," she said, her eyes no longer avoiding his. "She never opened it in front of me. But the night before she passed, she gave it to me and told me to keep it safe." And Richard felt his breath slow as she continued, each word pulling the truth closer. "I never opened it until recently," she added, her fingers brushing the necklace again. This paper was inside, and the realization settled fully now, not sudden, not explosive, but quiet and undeniable. Laura had not erased him completely. She had simply waited, left a single thread behind, not for herself, but for the daughter he never knew. And Richard lowered his gaze for a moment, something he had not done in front of anyone in years, because there was no strategy here, no control, just consequence. She gave you the truth, he said softly, and Emily nodded once, her expression calm, but no longer guarded, because whatever question had existed between them had already been answered in ways neither of them could undo. And for a long moment they simply stood there, not as a billionaire and a waitress, not as strangers, but as two people connected by something that had existed long before this room, long before this night, and yet had taken this long to surface. And Richard finally spoke again, not with authority, not with certainty, but with something unfamiliar, something honest. "I cannot change what I did," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I cannot go back to that moment and choose differently." And Emily listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just present, because she had spent her life without this conversation, and now that it was here, she was not going to rush it. "But I am here now," he continued, the words simple but heavy. "If that means anything at all." And Emily held his gaze for a long second, searching not for promises, not for apologies, but for truth. And what she saw was not perfection, not redemption, but something real, something unfinished, and she nodded slightly, not as acceptance, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement, because some things are not resolved in a single moment. Some things begin there. And she placed the corrected bill gently on the table, her hand steady once again, her voice returning to the calm tone that had never left her. "Your bill, sir," she said, and the word sir carried a different meaning now, not distance, not formality, but choice. And Richard looked at the paper, then back at her, understanding that whatever came next would not be defined by what he had been, but by what he chose to become from this moment forward. And as the quiet hum of the restaurant returned around them, unchanged, unnoticed, one truth remained. Some people walk away thinking their absence will be forgotten, but the truth has a way of waiting, patiently, until the moment it can no longer be ignored.